Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As well as discussing the threat posed by Russia, EU leaders will also discuss the state of play in the Brexit negotiations after agreement was reached earlier in the week on much of the transition deal. One issue which remains to be resolved is the future of the Irish border and the implications if the UK pulls out of the European Customs Union. Well, if no agreement is reached, the fallback option is for Northern Ireland to fully align with the Republic of Ireland and therefore the rest of the EU, a situation unlikely to be acceptable to many Brexit supporters. Well, joining me from central London to discuss this is the former EU trade negotiator Miriam González Durantes. Good afternoon to you, Miriam González Durantes. Theresa May in Brussels today, where the EU leaders will be rubber stamping that transition agreement, hailed at the beginning of this week by David Davis and Michel Barnier as a decisive step forward. What do you make of Britain's negotiating skills in this so far?
Well, I think it has indeed been a decisive step forward. There is a big remaining issue that you have just mentioned there, which is Northern Ireland. How this is being seen on the European side, if you look at the different media in different EU member states, has been as the UK conceding on most of the points. The issue that remains open there, the border in Northern Ireland, is an issue where I think that it is clear that what the parties have written there, that constructive ambiguity that we see in the transition agreement, is sustainable only for a little while, and at some point we will have to come to sort out that big conundrum that we have there, because there is no easy solution.
Yeah, reports today that the EU will give Britain 3 months to come up with a workable solution to the Irish border issue. Do you see that as being feasible?
I think that it is very difficult taking into account where the parties are right now. On the one hand, we have the UK government that has accepted the ambiguous drafting of the agreement, but we know, because the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said that they find accepting leaving Northern Ireland within the customs union and the single market unacceptable. She went all the way to say that no UK Prime Minister could accept that solution. On the EU side, we also know that the two proposals that the UK has put on the table now, namely to digitalise the border so that all the checks could be electronic, and the alternative proposal, which is basically to leave all the control to the UK authorities, customs authorities, carrying controls on behalf of the UK and the EU. Both of those proposals, I think, are unacceptable for the EU. It was only 1 month ago that the EU Commission was trying to find finding, actually, the UK customs authorities 2.4 billion euros for not controlling the border. So it is very unlikely, I think, that the EU could accept that. So we really have a bit of a standstill so far.
Another sticking point and potential headache ahead is the issue of Gibraltar. How much is this becoming a pawn in those negotiations?
Well, I think that so far it's a slightly procedural issue. The EU and Spain, including within the member state, has accepted that Gibraltar will leave. The transition agreement will apply to Gibraltar, to be technically correct, so that Gibraltar would not step out before the UK does at the end of the transition. But it's also true that there is still the reference there to the veto from Spain, which was part of the guidelines already that the member states agreed when they asked Michel Barnier to negotiate.
You previously said that Theresa May's Brexit is dangerous for the next generation. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't know whether I have said that it's dangerous for the next generation, but it is clear that it could represent an economic cost for the next generation. I think that it would represent also a political cost, and I imagine that that is why most of the young people in this country didn't vote in favour of Brexit.
Now, Theresa May will be joining other EU leaders in Brussels this afternoon, and our reporter Adam Fleming is, as ever, on hand to talk us through it. First of all, Adam, let's start with that transition deal. Apparently it's going to be discussed at the end of a dinner. It's not going to play a sort of key role in things today in Brussels.
So what's going to happen today is that there's going to be a dinner on a whole load of subjects, and when Theresa May intervenes, she'll talk about Russia, but she'll also welcome the progress made in the Brexit negotiations this week. Do you remember the document I was holding up on Monday with all the green highlighting on it? But the main discussion about Brexit will happen amongst the 27, so without Britain, tomorrow morning, where what they will do is they will sign off on the guidelines for phase 2. The first paragraph of the guidelines is welcoming that progress made this week, including on the transition deal. But then that paragraph, that crucial paragraph, goes on to say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. In other words, there is not true legal certainty on the transition period, or what the UK calls the implementation phase, until the whole Brexit treaty, of which the transition period is part, is signed off later in the year. Nevertheless, the Brits are very glad that there is language in there welcoming the transition, because it provides an extra layer of certainty for all those businesses that want to know what's going to happen.
OK, well, let's talk about Russia, because in light of the Salisbury attack, Theresa May is hoping for a strong, unified response from the EU to Russia. They have made a response, but she wants one directly condemning Putin. Will she get it?
I think she will. What we saw on Monday was a meeting of foreign ministers here. Boris Johnson was here, and they condemned the attack and said that they had strong solidarity with the UK. I think the language for that is going to be upgraded a bit to slightly harsher, tougher wording, which the Brits will be very happy about, because that's what they've been asking for. Their rationale is that President Putin will see a statement from 28 of his neighbours acting en masse, standing shoulder to shoulder with Britain. What will not happen today and tonight at this dinner, and what the Brits are not asking for, is new measures against Russia. For example, EU sanctions or individual nations taking their own steps. The Brits are not asking for that. What they want is that strong statement of solidarity. And I think the reason that the Brits aren't asking for that is that they know they might not get any more tonight, because what most of the other 27 EU countries are waiting for is the official process at the OPCW, everyone's favourite acronym, the Chemical Weapons Watchdog, who are doing their own investigations into what happened. Once the OPCW have said for definite this is Russia, that's when I think things will step up a gear.
And Adam, the result of the competition to make the new post-Brexit British blue passport is awarded to France.
Yes, so a British company, Delarue, which makes the passports now, was bidding for the contract to make the passports after 2019. They've lost out to a French company, meaning that this has already been dubbed Passport Gate. A few aspects to this. Apparently the procurement process isn't completely finished yet, so we have to wait for the final details about how this contract is actually going to look. There's lots of discussion about whether this French company will actually have a British subsidiary, and so that British passports will still be made on British soil. And Matt Hancock, the Culture Secretary, was on the Today programme this morning saying, just remember, one of the benefits of Brexit could be that once the UK is left, it will have more control over procurement rules and whether these competitions can be exclusively for British companies. Although having said that, if you read the guidelines that the EU leaders are going to sign off about phase 2, the future relationship talks tomorrow, public procurement's included in there. So maybe post-Brexit public procurement for the UK will look a little bit like pre-Brexit public procurement, and this could happen again in future.
I'll read through those guidelines again. Adam, thank you very much. And we're joined here in the studio by the Brexit-supporting Conservative MP, Theresa Villiers. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. First of all, the transition deal that Theresa May is hoping is going to be signed off. Is it a sellout to you and other Leave voters?
It's a compromise. I particularly regret that it's postponing the day when we take back control over our fisheries and our waters again. But the important question is what happens at the end of that implementation period. If we get the right new relationship with Europe, then that is the key issue for me. I can accept compromise in relation to the implementation period if the end result is proper respect for the referendum once we finish the implementation period. Right,
so it was worth the sacrifice for a greater or bigger prize. But do you think the government should have given way in the way they did over taking back something as fundamental as fishing rights and waters?
It was a difficult situation for them. I mean, I know from my conversations with businesses that they definitely wanted an implementation period, and I've actually argued for that from a relatively early stage, so I recognise if we were going to secure agreement on that, inevitably that did mean some compromises, and unfortunately one of those appears to have been in relation to the fishing sector.
What about another one? The fact that EU citizens arriving during transition will have exactly the same rights as those who arrived before. Are you happy with that?
I can live with that. I mean, obviously this was an area where the Prime Minister had, said that she wasn't going to allow that to happen, but if we are maintaining an implementation period where we get more or less the same rights as an existing member state, inevitably that means that we do probably take on almost all of the obligations as well. It's not a situation that I would have wanted in an ideal world. I would have wanted the benefits of leaving the EU to be gained at an earlier stage, but as long as we get them after December 2020, that is the important thing. That's the prize that we're seeking.
And can you live with the fact that Britain will have to abide by new laws introduced by the EU during transition without having a seat at the table?
Well, that is one of the most difficult points. I think there is, there obviously are attempts in the agreement that's been made for a joint committee to ensure that the two sides act fairly in relation to this implementation period, and that includes obviously a dialogue in relation to new laws being introduced. But that, for me, yes, is another compromise with which I am uncomfortable.
Right. I mean, you've compromised a lot, it seems, like the government. You agree with the government's compromise. I mean, in what way does the transition deal fulfil the Leaver's vision, your vision, of a sovereign country freed from the constraints imposed by European politicians, laws and regulations?
It won't deliver that until after the end of the implementation period, I'm afraid.
Right, so we're leaving at the end of March 2019, but actually we will have left the EU in name only. That's correct, isn't it?
You could describe it like that. I'm not sure I would use exactly those words, but we have to make compromises if we're going to make a success of Brexit, and we also need to recognise that the country remains divided about this. So being able to to listen to the concerns, different views, I think is very important if we're going to bridge the divisions that emerge.
Right. I mean, listening to Theresa May, it's sensible to be pragmatic, to compromise, because actually the bigger prize is the free trade deal, or rather the trade deal and relationship we have with the EU after Brexit.
Well, I think Theresa and people who share her view can be rather cool about it right now, because actually what we're seeing is a lot of theatre. It's worth saying, by the way, that I spend the rest of my time on the continent, and Brexit isn't a big deal elsewhere. For them, this is a kind of, it's a bit of shadow boxing. What will happen, and I think Theresa's right about this, what matters is what happens at the end. And we're not really anywhere near getting on to the question of migration, how you deal with services, the trade issues. A lot of that will happen during the transition stroke implementation period. So my feeling is that we can get ourselves all worked up about it, but the truth of the matter is lots of it isn't really... battle hasn't been joined on some of the key things yet.
Right, do you accept that?
I think that's a reasonable analysis. The big battle is yet to come. What happens when we leave in name as well as in fact at the end of 2020?
Right, so what, this is the phony war so far?
It's an important negotiation, but it doesn't address the very big question, which is what is the nature of our future relationship with the European Union?
Well, let's talk about something symbolic, which are these passports. Do you welcome the decision to award this contract for the new British blue passport to a Franco-Dutch company?
Well, we don't know that that's the final decision yet.
Oh.
But because from what I understand, from what you and others have said, the procurement process isn't completed.
Right. But if it is and it goes to the Franco-Dutch company, as it looks at the moment, would you welcome it?
We have to take into account the interests of taxpayers in getting value for money for public spending. And so on the whole, whilst I think we definitely need reform of our public procurement rules to make them much simpler, the principle that the government and public authorities looks to different bids, including bids from different countries, is one that I can support. It brings overall economic benefits. I wish in this case that perhaps the passports could have been produced in the United Kingdom.
But I mean, isn't that what it's all about, though, Theresa May? Wasn't that the whole point of the Leave vision, or certainly part of it? I mean, Theresa May said delivering the best Brexit is about our national future, part of the way we improve the lives of people all over the country. Our best days lies ahead. And yet, there we go, handing the contract to a Franco-Dutch company, countries in the EU that we are leaving. What does that say?
Leaving the European Union is not about pulling up the drawbridge and not doing business with other countries. We have a very open economy, including the way our public procurement works, and we gain significant economic benefits as a result, including the fact that companies here can make passports for governments across the world.
Oh, we look forward to that announcement.
Yeah, but this is part of the Leaver case that you guys didn't really say anything very much about. We can go out and compete in the world, but we're going to lose some of the time. And this is a case of losing. Delarue operate in many countries. I think they claim 40 countries. And I don't hear them going on about local preference when they make banknotes for Haiti or passports for somewhere else. Or, by the way, the $50 banknote for the country my family comes from, Guyana. I didn't hear them saying there should be a local Guyanese firm who do this. So I think, actually, they should stop whining. And if there's a future we should go into, I think, actually, Theresa, you should say, this is the way things are, and what we should really be doing is gearing up to compete more successfully rather than complaining when we come second.
Oh, you are absolutely right. This is all about being competitive and making sure that our businesses are producing absolutely the best bids, not only for UK public procurement, but for public procurement across the world.
Theresa, thank you for coming in.
Well, Theresa May is in Brussels tonight to rally support from EU leaders against what she's called Russia's brazen and reckless attack against the UK. She says it's clear that the Russian threat does not respect borders. And the Russian ambassador to the UK has accused Boris Johnson of insulting the entire Russian nation by comparing the staging of the World Cup there this summer to the Olympics in Nazi Germany. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg has the latest from Brussels.
Even tiny details can cause diplomatic rows. Tempers flare. No one wants to budge an inch. But the Prime Minister wants to shift the whole European Union to her way of thinking, that after the Salisbury poisoning against Russia, it's time to act.
It's clear that the Russian threat does not respect borders, and indeed the incident in Salisbury was part of a pattern of Russian aggression against Europe and its near neighbours, from the Western Balkans to the Middle East.
Persuasion is also about personal contact, of course.
I'm grateful for the solidarity and support that they've shown the United Kingdom. Thank you.
She wants a firm finger of blame pointed at Russia and other countries to crank up their attitude to Putin, perhaps following the UK in kicking out suspected spies. Support, yes.
Estonia fully condemns the attack and stands with our friend and good ally, United Kingdom.
The strongest political sign we can give is unity, unity and unity.
But fully signed up? Not quite.
We have to express our solidarity to UK, to the British people, but at the same time, we need to investigate.
We're going to be in full solidarity with the United Kingdom. I think that what occurred in Salisbury was loathsome and reprehensible. Attempted assassination or a chemical attack, no matter who does it, no matter where it happens, is something that we're going to condemn and condemn outright.
Do you believe that it was Russia? Do you believe it was Russia?
They're treading carefully. For some of the EU's top brass, like Jean-Claude Juncker, it's a balancing act.
President Juncker, do you regret congratulating Vladimir Putin on his re-election?
Even if Russia's near neighbours are on board.
Are you ready to back a firmer line like Theresa May?
Russia itself, again, slapped back at Britain, particularly irritated by the Foreign Secretary's suggestion that Putin might use the World Cup as Hitler did the Olympics.
The UK had a bad record, of violating international law and misleading the international community.
On his part, no regrets.
We don't want to escalate this any further. What we want is some kind of way in which they will at least accept that the Russian state must have had some role in this.
For Labour, treating Russia like a strategic enemy won't help. But over dinner here tonight, the Prime Minister will make that case.
For once, this bun fight in Brussels is not about Brexit, but Theresa May is trying to achieve something else, trying to get 27 other countries to take a firmer line on Russia. Quite a feat at any time. But when many people here in Brussels see Britain as an awkward neighbour, that is quite some diplomatic endeavour.
Can the Prime Minister persuade all of them to agree Russia is an enemy? Not easy when these days Britain doesn't always feel among friends. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Brussels.
We want to take you back to Brussels now, where the Prime Minister has been given her reaction to Alexander Yakovenko's news conference in central London. This is what the Prime Minister had to say.
I'll say a little bit about Russia in a minute, but what I'm going to be addressing today and focusing on today at this EU Council is the mutual opportunities and challenges that we're facing together as close friends and allies. Now, Russia staged a brazen and reckless attack against the United Kingdom when it attempted the murder of 2 people on the streets of Salisbury. I'll be raising this issue with my counterparts today because it's clear that the Russian threat does not respect borders, and indeed the incident in Salisbury was part of a pattern of Russian aggression against Europe and its near neighbours, from the Western Balkans to the Middle East. Now, today, obviously, we also commemorate the anniversaries of terrorist attacks in Westminster and Brussels, and as we remember the victims of those attacks, I will once again be stressing the United Kingdom's unconditional commitment to the future security of Europe, and I believe that together we can work to ensure that we overcome the challenges that we all face. I will also, of course, be talking about Brexit. I'm looking forward to talking about Brexit. We've made considerable progress through the agreement of the implementation period, which will bring certainty to businesses and people, and I look forward to the European Council endorsing that agreement and moving on swiftly to talk about the future partnership that we all want to build together.
Would you like to see further European Union sanctions against Russia?
Well, what I will be talking about today is not just what happened on the streets of Salisbury, but the fact that we do see this as part of a pattern of Russian aggression against Europe and its near neighbours, as I said, from the Western Balkans to the Middle East. This is a subject we have discussed before, and I look forward to further discussions with my European colleagues, and I'm grateful for the solidarity and support that they've shown the United Kingdom. Thank you.
So Theresa May not really commenting directly on what the Russian ambassador says, but talked about the brazen and reckless attack in Salisbury and a pattern of Russian aggression, and saying that she is very confident that she can get some kind of unity out of Europe about how to deal with Russia, aside from Brexit.
So the war of words between Russia and the UK is rumbling on. Theresa May wants a strongly worded statement, as we were discussing a little earlier, to come out of the EU Council meeting in Brussels, but says she's not looking for some big confrontation with Russia or regime change. But Boris Johnson's comments to a Commons committee yesterday have ratcheted up the rhetoric.
I think that your characterisation of what is going to happen in Moscow, in the World Cup, on all the venues, yes, I think the comparison with 1936 is certainly right, and I think it's an emetic prospect, frankly, to think of Putin glorying in this sporting event.
Boris Johnson. Well, this morning, in reaction to the Foreign Secretary's comments, the Russian Consul General in Edinburgh, Andrei Pitsapov, has suggested that maybe it's time for him to go. Boris, that is. With me now is the foreign policy expert John Hulsman, who's just published a book called To Dare More Boldly, The Audacious Story of Political Risk. So he should know a thing or two about this current situation. So. Well, yes, that's why we've asked you on, so I've got my fingers crossed. What do you make of Boris Johnson's comments?
I'm bored with lazy historical analogies. There's more to the world than Munich and Vietnam.
Right. I mean,
the Russians are a declining power. This is an aging gas station with nuclear weapons that has a GDP the size of the state of Texas. He's despicable. He can be managed. But if we compare him to Hitler, who was a rising power, we're going to get quite a lot wrong.
Right. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I think, you know, when Hitler or Churchill enter the rhetoric, you know that the person speaking has run out of things to say.
Well, isn't there a law that says if you're having a heated debate about history, there is a certain tipping point at which the Nazis always seem to be raised?
Totally.
Conversation
Absolutely.
killer.
But I think, I mean, it is sort of in bad taste and it's a bit vulgar. And I think there's a limit to how long Boris can get away with the undiplomatic language, which people find attractive, and when used in skillful hands, for example, I know this may seem odd, Trump, it can make things happen. But I think this is just a bit silly and really shouldn't have come up.
Well, perhaps we'll come back to the skilled comments of Trump that you're referring to, but of course he is meeting Kim Jong-un, isn't he, at some stage? I mean, do you think Theresa May is responding correctly to Putin? Just moving off Boris for a moment.
No, because again, I agree. The dichotomy between the Munich-like language and expelling 14 diplomats and their dog is laughable. If you really want to hurt the Russians, go after the money, follow the money. The oligarchs who live in London, who are tied to the Putin regime, if this is for real, you go after them, you do it quietly, you do it effectively, but the discrepancy between the rhetoric, which is apocalyptic, and the pipsqueak-like attitude is laughable, and that's what's wrong. They have to go together. The reason Trump worked was because he threatened with China using leverage, and everyone believed he might do it. And so the rhetoric matched what he might do, and then things move. If the rhetoric doesn't match the reality, someone looks laughable, and I'm afraid in this case it's Boris.
Well, and of course the government have complained about the mocking response from the Russian state. And in the last few minutes, the Russian ambassador to the UK, I think we've just heard for him, has said this. Alexander Yakovenko has been talking at a press conference about the Salisbury nerve agent attack.
The Foreign Office refused to share information on Sergei Skripal, stating that he is the British citizenship. Therefore, the British government has violated its obligations under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations by denying consular access for the embassy to the Russian citizens. We continue to insist that the access and full information on the condition of our compatriots, whom nobody has seen since 4th of March, should be provided.
I mean, is this handing the Russians really some more ammunition to fire back at us?
Well, it is. Again, if you talk in these draconian terms, the Russians will then sound wounded, which is their playbook. Of course the Russians were involved. Of course the Russians did it. Of course they don't want Putin dating my daughter. But let's, if we're going
That's
to...
a relief. I'm glad we cleared that up.
You can see the political risk is sorted there. But what we need to do is actually link what we want to do with things that can be done. Again, go after the oligarchs, and I'll take this seriously.
OK, so you do think the money, as other people have said too, is the leverage, is the way that you would actually hurt the regime?
The GDP is the size of the state of Texas. This is declining power.
Right, and that's the point. I mean, if Russia is so weak and its GDP is declining and is relatively small, why do they have so much power?
What they're doing, I mean, Putin has an 80% approval rating. This is great Russian nationalism. You go into his office, there's one picture there. It's of Peter the Great. Everybody understands that. I'm the strong czar bringing Russia back. And that is why he's popular domestically. Anything that makes him look that way plays to his strength. So the rest of the world condemns him is what he'd like.
Right, we've talked about Boris Johnson, but does it help when the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has said he's condemning government warnings over the threat posed by Russia? Mr Corbyn said claims that Russia was now a strategic enemy were not helpful or sensible. Has he got a point?
You know, the thing about Jeremy is that I'm really glad he's not a footballer, because he'd be scoring own goals all the time. I mean, this is just bonkers. Putin is a bad guy. Putin is... what he's doing, and one explanation for his power, is that he breaks the rules. And his election last week has given him a bigger mandate to continue breaking the rules of international discourse. And the problem is, until we accept that the rules are changing because bad guys are changing them, which means that we've got to do what we say we're going to do, attack the money and all of that, then actually he isn't at all disturbed by any of this.
Right. But then what does the British government do next? They're going to get probably this communique from the EU, which will be strongly worded, the government hopes, and will say Putin did it. We can't find another explanation for who was behind that attack. But then he's congratulated on his re-election by Jean-Claude Juncker, who's accused of being tone deaf, and Trump congratulates him too. I mean, does that matter, or is it important actually in terms of the ego of Vladimir Putin?
I think it's more important that one of Putin's narratives, again, beyond being the brave man standing up for Russian rights against a world against him, is how weak and divided his enemies are. And so when we don't speak coherently in the same way, it does look very, very bad indeed. And the EU is an example. It's a Tower of Babel. We have the Italians now, two parties who would want to, get rid of sanctions on Russia. We have other countries that would want to keep them forever. That dichotomy is exactly him going through the threading the needle and getting what he wants, and that's the problem.
Right, and is this the return of a new Cold War?
No, again, a Cold War was between superpowers. A wounded bear, which is what Russia is dangerous. There is no doubt Russia can be dangerous. But to pretend that these are two great superpowers fighting each other just doesn't explain what's going on here. Follow the money, use the money to grind the guy down. The GDP is the size of the state of Texas. In 2050, there'll be 10% fewer Russians than there are now. This is a weak power, not a strong power.
Well, the Russian ambassador to London has said Boris Johnson's comparison of World Cup to Nazi Olympics is totally irresponsible. I think we can listen to that. Let's see. No?
The British government is free to make a decision about its participation in the World Cup. But nobody has the right to insult the Russian people who defeated Nazism and lost more than 25 million people by comparing our country to Nazi Germany. That goes beyond the common sense, and we do not think British war veterans, including those of the Arctic convoys, would share this opinion.
Just very briefly, yes or no, should we boycott the World Cup?
No. By the way, forget, 1936 Olympics was a bad time for Hitler because Jesse Owens, black athlete, caned everybody. So it's not a really good precedent for Putin.
Right. Should we boycott it?
No, let's be serious.
OK. Thanks very much for coming in.
Well, those developments came as Russia's ambassador to the UK hit back at Boris Johnson for what he called an insult to the Russian people. Alexander Yakovenko was reacting to the Foreign Secretary's comments, comparing this summer's World Cup to Hitler's Olympics of 1936. Here's our security editor, Rohit Katru, on the rising tensions.
The diplomatic discourse is stuck in 1936, the comments of Boris Johnson moving things backwards, if anything. He said President Putin might treat the World Cup like Hitler did the Berlin Olympics. Today, the Russian ambassador responded. He said the comments were unacceptable and irresponsible.
The British government is free to make a decision about its participation in the World Cup. But nobody has the right to insult the Russian people who defeated Nazism and lost more than 25 million people by comparing our country to Nazi Germany.
He said he wrote to the Foreign Secretary this morning a long list of questions he says are unanswered.
What is their exact diagnosis, condition, and what treatment are they receiving? No information.
For more than an hour he spoke.
We'll just go like that. I'll answer all the questions. Please.
He said this wasn't a time for jokes, though he made a few.
Use our Twitter.
No word today from his leader, newly re-elected President Putin, who convened his Security Council to discuss what the Kremlin described as Britain's unfriendly and provocative approach. The Prime Minister in Brussels meeting EU leaders and describing a Russian threat that could strike any one of them.
Russia staged a brazen and reckless attack against the United Kingdom when it attempted the murder of 2 people on the streets of Salisbury. I'll be raising this issue with my counterparts today because it's clear that the Russian threat does not respect borders.
Once again, Moscow has said it wants to see nerve agent samples from Salisbury, but in this massive investigation, it is the only suspect. Rohit Katru, ITV News.
Theresa May at the European summit in Brussels
has given a warning to her fellow EU leaders. She said the Salisbury attack was part of a pattern of Russian aggression against Europe. But she hasn't got unqualified support around the table. Some EU leaders called for Britain to provide more evidence of Russia's involvement. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is at the summit in Brussels. Gary, how strong a message are the EU leaders sending?
They're probably not going to send as strong a message as Theresa May would like. She's going to address them round the table a bit later on tonight and tell them that Russia is a strategic enemy now, not a strategic partner. She's going to try and get them to back her line, which is that there is no question that Russia is guilty of the attacks in Salisbury. But she's probably not going to get anything like the form of words she would like. She has got some comfort, though, just now. She's just come out of a meeting with President Macron, Chancellor Merkel. They have said that there is no plausible other explanation for the Salisbury attacks other than the one that she has put forward. She's not going to quite get there with the other leaders. Russia is operating a very strong propaganda effort of its own. President Putin was on the phone to 3 of the EU leaders this morning before they came in here. All sorts of diplomatic efforts happening behind the scenes. Theresa May is going to talk about Brexit right at the very end of the evening, just as the chairs are scraping a sort of formal official moment when she gets to address the other leaders. But her focus here tonight is very much Salisbury and Russia.
In Brussels, Theresa May is telling Europe's leaders to stick together, to realise that Russia is now a strategic enemy for them all. But some here are readier than others to point the finger at Russia. Amongst the reluctant, Greece's Prime Minister, fresh from a congratulatory phone call to President Putin.
We need to investigate, but I think that we have to be very responsible on that issue.
Theresa May says she's 100% convinced the Russian state, right at the top, was involved in this. Are you 100% convinced?
But is there any evidence of this?
She feels that she's been giving people evidence. You don't feel you've seen it?
I don't know, but of course we trust our allies. If UK is saying this.
The government said it was getting stronger support from elsewhere, especially Scandinavian and Baltic countries.
First, we fully support United Kingdom in this situation, and we support the measures United Kingdom is applying, and all of us, we are considering such measures. The same I'm doing also as President of Lithuania.
So you could as well take measures, including expelling Russian diplomats from Lithuania?
Yes.
Yes.
Back in London, Russia's ambassador said Boris Johnson's comparison of this year's World Cup to Hitler's 1936 Olympics was a sign of post-Brexit Britain trying to assert itself.
It's very difficult for us because we're facing the new realities of the new diplomacy here in the UK. But we understand how it works. After 2 weeks of this kind of really wild statements, how are you going, just to talk to the Russians? Because, as I said today, that was really very insulting to the Russian people.
The incident in Salisbury was part of a pattern of Russian aggression against Europe and its near neighbours, from the Western Balkans to the Middle East.
Theresa May will warn EU leaders tonight the Russian state could be acting on their soil next. Her short contribution on Brexit will come much later this evening.
I will also, of course, be talking about Brexit. I'm looking forward to talking about Brexit. We've made considerable progress through the agreement of the implementation period.
She already knows what conclusions are going to be published by the 27 on Brexit tomorrow. Trying to introduce an element of surprise, Vince Cable was in town. After a meeting with his sister EU Liberal parties, including several sitting prime ministers, he issued a statement saying they were now supporting his policy of a second UK referendum on the Brexit deal.
You're supporting the Lib Dem line that there should be a second referendum in Britain on deal or no deal.
Let me be very clear. I can, of course, never interfere in British politics. But I do understand that my friends from the Liberal Democrats are very much trying to make sure that within the United Kingdom that debate is continuing.
Embarrassingly, the EU Liberal group then said their leaders had not signed up to a statement of support for Lib Dem policy. The Dutch Prime Minister said Brexit was not harming Theresa May's ability to win support for her hard line on Russia. But several countries are digging in their heels, and the EU communique tomorrow may acknowledge rather than support the UK accusation that President Putin's state apparatus was behind the Salisbury attacks.
Now, here in Moscow, I spoke to one senior Western diplomat who said that, looking at the current situation, he has banned the words "new Cold War" from his embassy. Why? Because the current situation, in his view, is arguably more serious, because the rules that defined the Cold War of old no longer exist. The lines are very blurred, and that creates quite a dangerous situation in which things could escalate and get out of hand. Now, no one is suggesting that we're on the verge of some sort of nuclear conflict, but what I think is absolutely evident here in Moscow is that there is a growing siege mentality here, that even those Russians who do not like Vladimir Putin and will tell you so in an ever so quiet voice, feel that Russia is more sinned against than sinning, that the original allegation against Vladimir Putin, that, the fact of this appalling nerve gas attack is as bad as the response from Britain, which they think is far too hasty, puts the finger on Russia before the investigation has completed. That is very much the line you hear from just about everyone here. And the one thing they're really upset by, of course, is that comparison by the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, going to DEFCON Boris. The architecture of Moscow sends mixed messages. There's the Kremlin, the fairy tale fortress of the Tsars, with high walls and turrets, from where Vladimir Putin has ruled the country for almost 20 years on and off, and continues to do so for at least another 6. Then there are the citadels of Western-style consumption, festooned with brands familiar on any British high street. The giant screens that could belong to New York, Tokyo or London. But behind this flickering facade lies the other secret, that Russia and the West have been growing apart for years now, behind a wall of pride and growing animosity. I met Vadim Konakov, producer of industrial pipes. No fan of Putin, he's already feeling the fallout from the Salisbury attack and Britain's reaction to it.
We already heard from people who are working with us, who are very friendly with us, who want to help us a lot. They told us, look, this is not the best time to export your products. And you know why? Only the fact that this product is from Russia makes a lot of problems for that kind of product to be sold, because they don't want to do it.
Seriously?
Yes, yes.
The less business you can do, the more you're punished for just being Russian by your partners in the rest of Europe, the more people in this country will feel they're living in a fortress.
If we're talking about fortress, Russia is a fortress, this is for those who want to keep conflict with Westerners warm. So you help them. You don't help so-called opposition in Russia.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But much of the fortress fanfare comes from Putin himself. Here he was at a pre-election presentation turned military show and tell with Russia's latest allegedly invincible missile. A strong nuclear power that feels like a victim, a dangerous combination. The Salisbury attack is spun here as yet another example of the West ganging up against Russia. Next, I'm off to the Academy of Engineering to meet a close friend of Russia's foreign minister and admirer of Vladimir Putin, a decorated engineer who's taught at some of Britain and America's best universities. Who did he think was behind the Salisbury attack?
You know, my opinion is, and I believe that I am right, that nobody did this. Maybe it was not good beer, maybe sushi in restaurants.
Food poisoning?
Because they are alive now. Yeah. They are okay. And
but they're not okay. They're in critical condition.
No. If Russian people from KGB or now would decide to kill somebody, believe it will be killed immediately. How is it possible to make such a mistake?
Thank God for music. Lucia di Lammermoor in rehearsal at Moscow's New Opera. Jan Latham Koenig is the chief conductor, a Brit who's been working in Moscow for over a decade. His Russian is fluent and his optimism resilient.
when you think of the immense respect that each country has for the other's culture. When I speak to people here, or my musicians or other people, friends of mine, they know more about Oscar Wilde and Dickens than most British people. And when I remember as a student growing up in London in the 60s and 70s, the hottest tickets were always to go and see Chekhov or Gogol at the Royal Shakespeare Company or National Theatre, or Rostropovich, Oistrakh, Svetlanov in Britain. That is to say, there is such a cultural respect between the two countries. I think this is what we have to concentrate on.
But do you think that these cultural ties will survive the diplomatic rift that is getting wider every day at the moment?
I think so, because I think people are bright enough to understand that if there's one strand that can actually help the situation, it is precisely these cultural ties.
I wouldn't bet on culture to save geopolitics. Russia's relationship with the West has many acts. The Salisbury attack is just the latest, and the ending has yet to be written.
Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, who's been in serious condition in Salisbury District Hospital after the nerve agent attack there, has been allowed home, a chance for him to recuperate. Meanwhile, the Russian ambassador to the UK faced the press today and was on feisty form, both defending his country and criticising this one.
She provided no proof of Russia's alleged involvement in the incident and made a conclusion that, as she put it, it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for it. Thus, the British government again built an official position, and I want to stress it, official position, on pure assumptions.
Well, Theresa May is in Brussels today for the European Council meeting there. She's only got another four of those before Brexit. But for her today, this one's all about Russia. Our political editor, Nick Watts, in Brussels for that meeting. Nick, give us the update on the support she's getting or not getting.
Well, a big moment for Theresa May in the last hour here in Brussels. The European Council has all but accepted the UK explanation for what happened in Salisbury. This is what Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, has tweeted. EUCO, that's the European Council, agrees with UK government that highly likely Russia is responsible for Salisbury attack and that there is no other plausible explanation. Now, the significance of those words are those are the words that will appear in the formal European Council conclusions tomorrow. Now, on that wording, Russia highly likely, that's about 80% of what the UK wants, because the UK believes Russia is definitively responsible. But the second bit, there's no other plausible explanation. That is absolutely the language that the UK would like to see. Now, it was interesting, around about 8 o'clock UK time, the Prime Minister started addressing the European Council on Salisbury. She was immediately supported by Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, the French President of the German Chancellor, who had met her beforehand. Then there were some member states who expressed a little bit of scepticism. They said, we would like to see more evidence. At that point, there was a second intervention from Angela Merkel. She says, I know what happened. I've seen the intelligence. Theresa May's explanation is correct. Then an intervention from Donald Tusk, and as I understand it, at that point, he got it across the line. So they've been talking about Salisbury for nearly 3 hours, and as I understand it, what they're talking about now is possible action by some member states to follow the UK example in expelling undeclared Russian intelligence officers.
OK, very, very briefly, Nick, I mean, just deconstruct this for us. How significant is this while Brexit's going along?
Significant at two levels. The immediate level, it helps Theresa May in what she's describing as her long-term challenge in tackling the Russian threat to all of us, to all of Europe. But secondly, it's bigger than that. Last September, in her Florence speech, Theresa May said that the UK, whatever happens in Brexit, would make a unilateral declaration of support for Europe's security. Well, that test has appeared to pass its first outing.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, earlier this evening, I spoke to Sandro Gozzi, the Italian Minister for European Affairs. I asked him where Italy stood on the issue of Russia.
Well, what is happening is very serious. Italy is on UK side, has shown full solidarity. We need the full evidence about the responsibilities. In this very moment, they are defining the EU stance, which must be united, must be bold, must be clear.
But it may be that the British are not going to be able to give you 100% proof, but if the British could persuade you that the Russians did it, would you be keen to, say, expel diplomats, Russian diplomats, as the British have?
Listen, I think that there are several ways of respond to such a serious event. And as I said, in my view, what is important is that there is a unity of the EU as a whole.
What did you think of the Jean-Claude Juncker letter to Putin, congratulating him, His Excellency, as he put it, congratulating him on his re-election? I mean, I think a lot of people here were surprised to congratulate anyone on re-election when the election is quite often regarded as rigged.
It's part of the job of the President of the Commission. Then, I think that there is a lot of work to be done, because it is clear that the relationship with Russia is more and more complicated, and certainly it's become even more complicated and more serious after the event in London.
I mean, your country has a rather interesting attitude towards Russia, doesn't it? Why does Berlusconi have such a respect for Putin? Why does the Five-Star Movement want to end sanctions? What is it about Italy, populists, and cozying up to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I can tell you what I told to a Russian representative when they came to see me a few months ago. They have been very keen in having a positive relationship with the Five-Star Movement. They have been in general very keen in looking, paying attention and giving some kind of political support to anti-European populist and extremist movement all over Europe. In my view, this is a fundamental strategic mistake which is being made in Moscow. I don't think that the real interest of the Russian Federation is to see a weakened European Union. And I don't think that the real interest of the main parties in Moscow is to foster the relationship with the anti-European movement. It is a legitimate choice. In my view, it is a wrong choice, and it's something, in my perspective, is certainly a matter of concern.
I note you say you think it's legitimate for Russia to support, you know, separatist movements, but which is an interesting thing we could discuss at more length.
I cannot say that it's not legitimate to have a relationship, for example, with a movement which get 18% in democratic elections in my country. I do not share that approach, but I cannot say that it's not legitimate. I think that is a strategic mistake.
Last one. Has Brexit had any effect on the response that Theresa May has had when talking to the other EU countries?
No, not at all. Not at all. Also because even with Brexit, if there is something on which the two sides are very clear, have been very clear, and I hope will be very consistent in the future, the two sides are the European Union and the United Kingdom, is to build up a strong partnership in security, in defence and in home affairs. And I think that what has happened in the last days in London shows that Brexit or not Brexit, and it's going to be Brexit, the security partnership between the Union and the UK is of the utmost importance, and that in the future we will have to shape a new partnership. And I think that in the continent we must move fast towards a new security policy, towards the Europe of defence, towards a more effective action in the home affairs. And if we do so, the partnership with the UK will be even more effective, more interesting, both for London and for the European capitals.
Sandro Gozzi, thank you so much for talking to us tonight. Thank you very much.